So welcome everyone. We're here again for another virtual lunchbox talk today, Losing Venus, the Perils of the Carolinas' Most Charismatic Plant with Johnny Randall. So I am Joanna Lalikas. I oversee the education department at the North Carolina Botanical Garden. And with me, I have David Michaud, who is helping today with moderation. And he's our facilities rentals coordinator and also our interim registrar. All right, so I want to introduce our speaker today. Johnny Randall is Director of Conservation Programs with the North Carolina Botanical Garden. He received his bachelor's in biology at UNC Chapel Hill, at UNC Charlotte, sorry, Johnny. And both his master's and his PhD in botany at Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University. And for a total of 10 years, Johnny was a faculty member at Salem College, the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and University of North Florida. He joined the North Carolina Botanical Garden in 1998 as Assistant Director for Conservation and is also adjunct faculty at UNC Chapel Hill. His training and research interests are in plant reproductive ecology, rare plant biology, and conservation biology. And at NCBG, he oversees our conservation and management of natural areas and administers rare plant programs. Johnny also serves on numerous boards and advisory committees and is the past president and current board member of the North Carolina Exotic Pest Plant Council. So we'll have time for some questions at a couple of stopping points and at the end. And Johnny, thank you for joining us. We will stop sharing our screen and hand it over to you.
So today we're going to be talking about, or I'm going to be talking about, and you're going to participate in my presentation on Venus flytrap. Venus flytrap, outside of agricultural crops, it is probably the most recognized plant on the planet. Even on, I've seen this U-Haul go by before with Venus flytrap on it and a pitcher plant, but it has captured the imagination of people for a long, long time. And it is a monotypic genus in the Droseraceae, the sundew family, and Dionea refers to Aphrodite as the daughter of Dione, the Greek goddess of love, and the Roman equivalent Venus. If you do a direct translation, it's really Dione's mousetrap, and flytrap came a bit later from that. My slides aren't changing they're not changing for me.
Sometimes you may have to click in the bottom left corner of that presentation. The arrows may appear down there.
Okay, usually I just do it on my laptop. Okay, so here's your first question. Actually, the first question I wanted to ask is, what are you doing inside right now rather than outside on such a beautiful day? But here's my second question. To where is Venus flytrap native? And you can just think of this to yourself. You don't need to answer that in the chat, but just think about it for a second and I will tell you the answer in just a moment. So of those choices, I hope you picked the Carolinas, because that is indeed where Venus flytrap is from. And most people say a 90-mile inland radius of Wilmington, North Carolina. It has shrunk considerably since those the early exploration and recognition of its range. So all of the counties in blue are where it is now extirpated or locally extinct, and the tan-colored ones are where it still currently occurs. And in Horry County, South Carolina, it's only one population, very small one, near the North Carolina border. And I'll talk about that one briefly in a bit. And if you didn't get the right answer, Carolinas, that's okay, because the folks at Harvard don't get it right either. I don't know if you've ever visited their glass flower exhibit, But it is truly an amazing display if you ever have that opportunity. And when I was there, I noticed that they have the range for Venus flytrap as the mid-Atlantic coast to Florida. And I contacted the curator of the Glass Flowers about that, and they were very strident in their answer that yes, it is native from Florida to through the mid-Atlantic because of the places where people have planted it. It's been planted in Florida. It's been planted in the New Jersey Pine Barrens. It's not native there. I asked them, under ginkgo, do you show that it's occurs worldwide or rather simply only in Asia? But anyway, won't go into that anymore, but just wanted to point out that not everybody gets it right, even at higher institutions. Now, there is so much information available on Venus flytrap out there on the World Wide Web and in publications and books, and it's just amazing how truly well known this plant. This was an exhibit they had at the Royal Botanic Garden in Sydney called Plants That Bite. So this is a cute little ad for that, a news program that promoted that. I was actually on Science Friday a few years ago talking about poaching in Venus flytraps. There's some nice videos, and I think Joanna's going to post the link to this seasonal science video that is kind of cute that UNC TV put together. So lots of information out there. There is an International Carnivorous Plant Society that is very active. And they support research as well. That's where we received a large grant for a project that I'll talk about in a little while. They have a Facebook page, which is very active, lots of information. International Carnivorous Plant Society is all about cultivation and responsible gardening and responsible cultivation of Venus flytraps and other carnivorous plants. So they're certainly a legitimate organization. Lots of cartoons. I'm not going to read these. I'll let you do that. But I have a binder full of cartoons of Venus flytraps. And this is one of my favorite ones. Why would a fly ever land on something like that? Look like that? Mice should be ashamed, etc., etc. Anyway, kind of a funny one. Then they end up looking it up on the internet. This was in the News and Observer just a few weeks ago. I like to clip and save these. I don't know if you've been to Wilmington, North Carolina, but they certainly celebrate flytraps there. Down on the riverfront near where the USS North Carolina is, they have this incredible Venus flytrap sculpture. There's Flytrap Brewery in Wilmington, and they do have very nice beers. They have sculpture in their beer garden. And we at the Botanical Garden have always been interested in Venus flytraps, in particular, carnivorous plants in general. This was our first holiday float in the Chapel Hill Carborough Holiday Parade, where Jeffrey Neal is our Venus flytrap surrogate. And we have a beautiful carnivorous plant collection. Many of you, I'm sure, have visited these. That is, of course, contains Venus flytraps. And now I'll just throw out that there are more different kinds of carnivorous plants in Brunswick County, North Carolina than anywhere else in the entire world. There may be more sundews in Australia, but in terms of diversity, North Carolina, Brunswick County is the hot spot of the world. We use Venus flytraps in our education programs, including this Wonder Sphere that we used to, this whole program, the visiting plant, I'm sure it's not called, I'm forgetting what it's called now. But at any rate, Katie is now running this program herself, the Wonder Sphere, and taking plants to immunosuppressed kids and such in hospitals. So they have certainly learned a lot about Venus flytraps from Katie. And some of you may know that we have a Venus flytrap specialty plate before the North Carolina legislature. we had over 750 prepaid applications. This was delayed in the last legislative session because of COVID priorities and other things, but it will be in front of the legislature in their first 2021 session. So we look forward to having that. That will generate lots of money for plant conservation for the Botanical Garden and for the North Carolina Plant Conservation Program. So who first published on how the trap trigger mechanism works in Venus flytrap? Was that Charles Darwin, Asa Gray, Aristotle, Andre Michaud, not related to David Michaud, or at least I don't think so. They spell their names differently, but they're both French. Or John Lawson, who traveled through North Carolina as one of the first explorers. Well, if you picked Charles Darwin, you are correct. He was the one that first published on that. But certainly there were probably American Indians who were fascinated by this plant, and they didn't publish on this, but could very well have figured that out. And I had the opportunity to visit Down House, the home of Charles Darwin, not only his home, but also his laboratory several years ago with my family. It was really quite the pilgrimage. If you ever get a chance to do that, it's in Kent, right outside of London, and just beautiful gardens. Just, you know, it really blew me away to visit there. And was able to go in Charles Darwin's actual greenhouse, and they've restocked it, of course, with carnivorous plants that he studied. These were not the ones he studied, but it was just really, almost an emotional thing for me to see Venus flytraps in Charles Darwin's greenhouse. And many of you might not know that he published an entire volume on insectivorous plants, and he called Venus flytrap one of the most wonderful plants in the world. And that's a drawing from that particular volume. And I'll just go over, you can have a look at this, but he did talk a lot about Dionea. And he would have delighted in all of the research that's going on now on how the signaling mechanism works. This paper recently came out in Nature Plants on this calcium pathway so the way that the mechanism works is that there are 3 hairs on each side of the trap, and either one has to be plucked simultaneously twice, or 2 separate hairs have to be plucked in a row. And that's presumably to keep it from closing in a false way when there's nothing in the trap. So if a drop of rain hit it or something like that happened, it's only really the movement of an insect inside there that should trigger it. Then it closes up, it seals up, secretes digestive enzymes, and absorb the nutrients and minerals from that particular insect. So some of the research that we've done at the garden is through a cooperative program with NC State University, where no one had ever really determined what the pollinators were of Venus flytrap, and how they separated, or if they did separate their prey from their pollinators. And that was all answered by the folks at NC State with the help of Mike Coons in Rebecca Irwin's lab. So it was really an incredible study. I mean, they collected hundreds and hundreds of insects and washed pollen off of them, watched them in the field. And Laura Heyman at NC State is continuing this particular project, looking at many of the other different elements of what attracts pollinators to Venus flytraps, among other things. But what they determined was there was a nearly complete separation in what insects are found in the flowers and the traps. So Venus flytrap does not eat its pollinators, but rather crawling insects like spiders, crickets, things like that. So Here's where David is going to take some of your answers from this question. So what do you want to know about Venus flytrap, but we're always afraid to ask?
We're going to let those questions come in using the question and answer function. I have one based on slides that we've seen already. Can the flytrap open back up after it consumes an insect?
That is a great question. Yes, it can. And one trap will open 2 to 3 times after it's been closed. That's why if you have, your own Venus flytrap at home, if you like the traps, then you're not going to keep fooling around with it and making it close to amaze yourself or your friends.
All right, we had one come in now. When do Venus flytraps flower?
They flower in early summer in June.
Okay. Can you give other examples of carnivorous plants?
Well, the ones that we have in North Carolina are, so there's, of course, Venus flytrap. There are the pitcher plants, genus Sarracenia. There's butterworts, the pinguiculas. There's bladderworts, and there's sundews. So we have 5 different genera of carnivorous plants and about, I think it's 28 different species. We have in North Carolina, we have half of the carnivorous plant species in the entire country.
I think you're going to be touching on this later in the presentation, but how do they propagate Venus flytraps and how long do they live?
Mm-hmm. Well, they probably are fairly long-lived plants. No one really knows how long they actually live, but propagation is by seed, tissue culture, or by making separations of the plant, sort of through little plantlets that it will put off.
Okay. We're getting a number of questions about home gardening. Can they be grown outside in a home garden? And also, what is the best way to overwinter a potted Venus flytrap?
Okay. Well, I will refer you to the International Carnivorous Plant Society or our own botanical garden for how to best care for them. That's, it's really quite easy. And you can have your own home barb garden, but there are some things you need to pay attention to. And one thing that is important to know that Venus flytraps do need to go through a dormant period. So you do have to leave them outside for a bit. Let them go dormant for a month or more. And then you can bring them and put them on a sunny windowsill in the house for the rest of the winter and get them to come back out. But they do fine outside, of course.
Great. I'm going to skip over a couple of these questions because I know you're going to be touching on them later in the presentation. How many populations are left within that extant range you showed on the map?
That's a good question. The North Carolina Natural Heritage Program is doing, they're into their second year of a range-wide census. And so they are determining that, but there are hundreds of populations around the state. A few of them are on protected land, though.
I've received a couple of questions about Brunswick County in particular, if you know how many species are native just to that area.
Carnivorous plant species?
Mm-hmm.
Probably 20 different carnivorous plant species.
All right, and one last one before we move on. Has anyone measured how fast in millimeters per second the trap moves?
Yes, they have,
Yeah.
and it's really fast. Fast enough to catch a fly.
Okay.
If you've ever tried to catch a fly, they're not easy.
All right, well, thank you for that, Johnny. We'll have more time for questions later on in the program.
Okay, great. Good questions. So this will answer some of those questions that you had with respect to the current status of fly traps in the state. So in 1958, in the first range-wide inventory, half of known populations are now extirpated, meaning locally extinct. 31 EOs. Now an EO is what's called an element occurrence. So this can be either referred to a single individual or more typically a population. I need to move. Okay, that's okay. So 40% of extant populations contain 10 to 100 individuals, and that will give them a D rank in terms of their, their viability, long-term viability potential. And now poaching in the counties where it is most prevalent is a felony, and I'll talk more about that. It's a candidate for state listing through the Plant Conservation Program, and it's also it's been petitioned for listing under the Endangered Species Act through the Fish and Wildlife Service. So these are dots of all the known populations in the state, and it shows their different ranks, from the purple being A ranked, and you see there are very few of those. There are lots of extirpated, historical, failed to find, E rank, D rank. So it really has dropped in population number over the years. NatureServe, which does the ranking of plants in terms of their endangered status or not. And it was recently moved to G2 imperiled on the red list. So this is an international list that's put together by the IUCN, the International Conservation Union. So it's now vulnerable by the red list. So that's a step down for sure, and also a step down in the NatureServe listing, globally imperiled now. The gentleman on the right is Don Waller, professor at University of Wisconsin, and this was as close as he ever got to a Venus flytrap until 2 summers ago when he visited populations here in North Carolina. And it is Don who has he's the primary petitioner for it to become an endangered species and listed under the Endangered Species Act. That is still in process. So why is it so vulnerable now? Why has it been delisted to or uplisted to a global threatened status or imperiled status? Well, one thing is habitat destruction and management of habitats. It's one of the many species in our coastal plain that really does require fire for its survival. Venus flytraps go flat on the ground, and if they get shaded out, they don't last for very long in a particular environment. So fire suppression is one of the greatest threats to Venus flytrap populations. And I'll talk about other threats in a second. And the habitats within which they burn, so this is part of the longleaf pine ecosystem, and they occur in a special element of that called a wet pine savanna. And and all of the other plants that occur in these wet pine savannas and longleaf pine ecosystem are also very much fire dependent, including longleaf pine. And this is what happens with infrequent fire return. And I would say that it needs to be burned, that habitat, every 1 to 3 years. So this is probably an area where this was a known occurrence in this site where we were going to collect seeds and tissue. Probably hadn't been burned in 5 years. This is one of North Carolina state parks. And you can see the fire scars on these trees that it certainly has been burned in the past, but fire is long overdue here. And I'm not blaming state parks. They have a lot to do, and they do a lot of burning, and you can't always burn. The conditions might not be right, but this is, you can't see this, but this is one very depauperate Venus flytrap I found in this particular site, all because of lack of fire management. And speaking of fire, this is one of the really fabulous populations down in Pender County where there was a wildfire nearby, and people fighting the fire weren't paying close attention. And it was a lot easier putting a plow line through this power line rather than going through some other area. But they plowed up a huge population of Venus flytraps and other rare plants when they did this. So it's sort of this unwitting destruction of habitat that should definitely not happen. This is also actually state-owned land. And that's my son. When he was a young fellow standing in the same power line, we were counting Venus flytraps some years ago. So this is considered a good habitat here, one that's burned regularly. This is the Green Swamp in Brunswick County, and just a beautiful site. The Nature Conservancy manages this area. The Nature Conservancy owns thousands of acres of coastal land that they burn regularly, and they're incredible stewards of the land. And this is one of the real hot spots and strongholds for Venus flytrap. So this is a good habitat. This is bad habitat. You saw that picture in the upper right-hand corner a second ago, but also some of these other places where the hydrology has changed. And it's not certain why this has happened, but it could be through agricultural practices, pulling groundwater below certain critical levels for these wetlands to stay intact. And I think you can see my cursor here, but here's a little dried up flytrap that is really sad that this particular site is really no longer a viable. We found 3 dried up flytraps here. So this is probably not going to last very long. And then there are the ugly sites where, and I've made up this, if you're into community classification, this is a made up one, coastal plain back road asphalt seep wet subtype. But this is a ditch on the side of the road where it's teeming with Venus flytraps, but there's totally inhospitable habitat on both sides. Roadside on one side, power line cut on the other side that is sprayed with herbicides to keep it open. And these are populations that are probably kind of the living dead. And so when we collect seeds from sites like this, we tend to over collect, as it were, what's called a rescue collection. So we have collected lots of seeds from this site that can be used for a reintroduction nearby if some land became available for it that was suitable. So we have, I'll talk more about that in a bit. And this is the one good population in South Carolina. And it is just right outside of Myrtle Beach, place called Lewis Ocean Bay Heritage Preserve. And this habitat may look bad to you, but actually it's really great because they've just burned it. But burning there is going to become somewhat questionable because a highway has just been put in right through the middle of this nature preserve so that folks can get to Myrtle Beach faster. And this was very controversial. This will also impact the natural heritage folks in South Carolina from burning the site, because putting smoke across the road is going to be a problem. Maybe they'll close the road when they burn. I don't know if they're going to be able to do that, but at any rate, this was a sad event in my mind. Then there's the commercial trade in Venus flytrap, where that's probably responsible for a lot of the poaching that has taken place. And this is a legitimate site. I'm not trying to criticize Flytrap Farm. They are a legitimate place. To S&J Greens is where we get our fly traps. We don't propagate them anymore ourselves, but we get tissue cultured plants or plant separations from S&J Greens. There's all kinds of cultivars out there that really are amazing. Here's S&J Greens at one of our plant sales. And they're selling all kinds of really great carnivorous plants. Now, this is an old picture. This is a questionable vendor. I think we know for sure that fly traps that were sold here in the 70s were certainly poached, but I think that they are not poaching any longer. You can still find this little place selling fly traps, but I think they're doing a much better job now. Big penalties now, as I mentioned earlier, it's a felony. And these fellows who were caught, it was $1 million bail that they were put in jail under. And I'm not sure what the outcome of their particular incarceration was. And we're one of the designated sites for receiving poached plants, rare plants in general. And we do receive Venus flytraps on occasion and pitcher plants. And when we receive these plants, we keep them for a year or so they can get good roots on them. And then we put them back out in the wild in areas where if we know where they came from, then that's where we put them back. If not, we put them in protected sites that are properly managed. And here are these two poor fellows who were charged poaching Venus flytraps from a North Carolina plantation. Here's a wanted poster. Judge Judy gets in on it. And this is a question for you. How might you spot a poached Venus flytrap for sale over one that's nursery grown? And let me point out that this is a little joke on those two guys in that picture. You may recognize them, you may not, but the fellow on the left is director of our herbarium and employee of the Botanical Garden, Dr. Alan Weekly, and the fellow on the right is our director, Dr. Damon Waite. So this is here just to goof on them. So I hope this, if Damon ever runs for president, I don't want this to turn up as a negative political ad for him. So how might you spot a poached Venus flytrap?
Couple ideas that have come in so far. Poor root development or severed roots. Possibly marked with a luminescent marker. Price could be an indicator. Weeds or plants that make it look like it was pulled from the ground recently. Perhaps the fact that it was sold online.
Okay, well, those are all absolutely correct. And there's some other things to look out for too. And that is, someone pointed out, a plant that has other weedy things in it, especially ones that you would find associated with Venus flytraps like the one on the right. But also, if you have plants that don't look uniform, because most plants that you find for sale on our own plant sale or elsewhere tend to be done by tissue culture, and they're all very uniform. They look like they've been stamped out. But all those other answers were really great. And this is a picture of Leslie Stark. You may have heard her talk a few weeks ago on the rare plants of Durham County and Durham Dye Base. So Plant Conservation Program protects lots of Venus flytrap sites on the coastal plain. They're properly managed, and this is Leslie repatriating some that had been poached. So our own Elaine McManus, now at the Botanical Garden, our volunteer manager, did a internship with the Nature Conservancy and the Plant Conservation Program some years ago. And she did a whole project on looking at just, what was going on with poaching and who was doing the poaching, and created this flow chart. And it, according to her investigation, it looks like that it is the commercial trade is where the poaching is taking place most of all. There was a idea that it was being poached for this cancer drug called Carnivora, but it looks like now that that's probably not the case, that they're only using plants that are cultivated. But nonetheless, Carnivora is, at least what I have learned, is that it is not really a legitimate treatment for cancer or for what ails you with respect to clinical trials. So don't go dig any up thinking that you can extract something from it to help you with your indigestion. So what do you think are ways to prevent the poaching of Venus flytraps and even other rare plants? This is a very difficult question. I don't know all the answers, that's for sure. And I don't know what works best, but other people have commented on this. And by the way, those fellows down there are not poaching Venus flytraps. They are admiring them, but it was the closest I've come to taking a picture of someone who looked like they might be poaching them. And we'll just give this a couple of more minutes. I will talk about some of the ideas, but if you do come up with any good ideas that you don't get posted or that I don't mention, please do get in touch with me directly through email or a phone call. You can find my contact information on the Botanical Garden webpage, because I would really like to know. All recommendations are welcome.
Yeah, we have a number of good responses coming in now. First, I'd like to highlight support the North Carolina Botanical Garden and the Nature Conservancy. That, of course, has a great effect on helping these populations. Some other ideas that have come in: severe penalties, educate the public, which I think we're doing right now. More presence of wildlife enforcement officers, undercover sting operations, license all sellers, perhaps a network of trail cameras, maybe increase responsible cultivation and commercial practices that'll take pressure off of wild plant populations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are all great. And I will just turn the page and give you some of the ideas that came out. I'm forgetting her name now. This woman is an attorney. She wrote an article in the Revelator on how to take a bite out of Venus flytrap poaching. She's actually out in California, has never traveled to the eastern United States or seen Venus flytraps in the wild, but she has great interest in this. And her ideas are, one, work to resolve what's called poverty poaching. People who are just trying to eke out a living, and this is something that they can do, just for a few dollars. And it's true. This is a lot of times poachers are getting 25 cents per fly trap. Wish there could be an incentive program that the state of North Carolina could give them 50 cents for every one they didn't poach, for example, but that's not really a viable way to do things. There's the Lacey Act, which protects endangered species trade worldwide, and there are provisions in that can help go after the people who are actually hiring these poachers to go out. It's not the poachers that we really need to go after, it's the middleman who is paying them to go out there. And also to use these felony protection to create disincentives for poaching. Certainly $1 million fine and possible years in prison for this is a disincentive, but you have to get that information out to the poachers that they could go to jail for a very long time. And hopefully the poachers that are being caught now are ratting on who they're poaching for. So I'm going to change gears a little bit and talk about the project that was funded through the International Carnivorous Plant Society for our, it was really a two-part project. One is to sample at least 150 populations across the entire range for both tissue and create a long-term seed bank, and also to evaluate the standing genetic variation in 40 of these sites. for some very sophisticated genetic study. And what we wanted to do with the genetic study, we're using this RAD-seq or next generation analysis that can look at thousands of restriction sites, and it can actually look at how Venus flytrap populations differ within and between, but also how it has moved around in the landscape in terms of, because 60 million years ago, the oceans filled the coastal plain. So there had to be Venus flytrap had to migrate inward, and then it had to migrate back out to recolonize habitat as it became available. And that took many thousands of years for that to happen. And I'll go through some of our results. And
Tommy, just a quick time check. You had asked to know when there's 10 minutes left. We are at
okay,
that point.
thank you. As these are some of the primary research questions, and some have to do with more esoteric things like, are there even cryptic subspecies of Venus flytraps, or is it just a single species? And I won't read through all of these, but we are partnering with the UNC Center for Genome Sciences on campus they're doing all this analysis for us, which has been a great partnership. So you've seen this map before. These are where we have collected. And let me point out one population up here that I think is very interesting. So this green blob right here happens to be Fort Bragg in the Sandhills. And it is thought that this is the refugial population or the refugium for Venus flytrap when all of this area was underwater. Now, not all of this area was underwater, as we'll see in a second. It was more or less, but not every bit of it, perhaps. So anyway, this is where we collected throughout the range. This shows some of the flytraps in the wild where we did collect. And there are a couple of populations on private property where they had just thousands and thousands of individuals, and we collected what are called bulk seed collections in these sites. We've made bulk collections on a property off of Sidbury Road, and I know that the owner of that property is on today because she said hello, and we appreciate your letting us collect there and make a bulk collection there. But there's some other ones that we've done that on private property as well. But most of the time we collect only 10% of the seeds in any 10 years, okay? Those are the guidelines that the Center for Plant Conservation sets out. So in these 2 years of intense collecting, we collected over 94,000 seeds from 65 sites. And that is a lot of seeds. And not only were these collected, a lot of seeds collected, but they're collected by maternal line, meaning that each envelope that you see there, so this row of envelopes right here, for instance, is from a single population, and every envelope is from a different plant. So we keep those separate from one another. And I won't ask you why we do that. I'll just tell you since we're running out of time. But it's because if we wanted to do a reintroduction to a site, we would want to just pull a few seeds out of each of those to maximize genetic diversity for replanting. Also, if someone wanted to look at more of the genetic structure of a population, you need to have samples from as many different individuals as possible. This is one of our work study students cleaning the capsules, the seeds from capsules. You can see how tiny those are. Those are not mustard seeds, but they're about the same size. It's really amazing. We keep very good records on our populations where we collect. The particular element occurrence place, name, the date it was collected, whether we collected tissue or not, whether it was seed, by maternal line, bulk, etc. So lots of really great data that is mostly being managed by Mike Coons at the Botanical Garden. And each population is tested for viability before it goes into the seed bank. So these are tiny little Venus flytrap seedlings. And I should have shown you a close-up because the first true leaf that comes out is a little trap. I mean, they come out snapping. And one time I was looking at these, I'd taken some out of the Petri dish and potted them up and put them in the greenhouse. And they're so small that you have to use a magnifying glass to see them almost. And I was looking in there with the magnifying glass, and a tiny, tiny, tiny little baby spider crawled into a trap and was eaten. And I wouldn't have been able to see that without a magnifying glass. So once we collect the seeds, put them in the paper envelopes, they're transferred to foil envelopes that are vacuum sealed with this information on there at the relative humidity and the temperature at which they were sealed, and then they go in the freezer. And these, you have to, in order to properly store seeds in a freezer, you need to desiccate them to a certain extent, but usually around 18–20% relative humidity or so. And you have to vacuum seal them. Not all seeds can be frozen. Not all seeds can be dried. Oak seeds, for instance, cannot. They die if they dry out. So anyway, so this is the way it's done, but it reminded me of Han Solo, if you're a Star Wars fan, in carbonite. So tissue collection. This was not easy. The genome science folks wanted these on dry ice, and to haul a cooler with dry ice a mile into the swamps of the Pocosons of eastern North Carolina can be troublesome. But anyway, we would collect 3 to 4 traps as we were able, put them in dry ice, and freeze them. Keep them on dry ice, turn the cooler over to the folks at the Genome Center, and then they put them in their minus 18, I forget now. Anyway, really cold freezers, they're deep freeze. And then they extract the DNA from those. And the preliminary results from this study are really exciting. It shows that there are 4 primary clusters of Venus flytraps, and which is really, and they match with the geography of the area. So these are the plants of what is called the Cape Fear Arch. These are plants of what's known as the Onslow Bight. This is right outside of the Cape Fear Arch, and these are the Fort Bragg populations. So what we will ultimately know is the relationship among all of these individuals or all of these populations, and within population variation too, once all that research is finished up. And hopefully that will be finished in the near future. And I'll talk about that again sometime, I'm sure, when that research is completed. So you don't do this alone. These are, I'm sure I've missed some people, but we have a lot of folks who have volunteered with us, and from a lot of different agencies, as well as our own volunteers at the Botanical Garden and elsewhere. So there's Fish and Wildlife Service, Plant Conservation Program, Natural Heritage Program, the Nature Conservancy, North Carolina State Parks, Department of Defense, UNC Wilmington, North Carolina Botanical Garden, the Highway Safety Research Center, and I think that covers most of those parenthetical organizations. So that's it. And thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks, Johnny. We have a couple more minutes. David, if you want to ask a couple more questions that we have in the Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a couple questions about seed dispersal. One, how is it done? And also, do some insects devour Venus flytrap seeds? And is that part of the dispersal?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are certainly seed predators. I don't know what predates Venus flytrap seeds, but that's for sure. That's why plants have to make lots of seeds. There need to be enough for some things to eat and still have enough to propagate. Now the seeds are so tiny, they're round, they roll around on the ground, so they are passively dispersed by wind and water and just simply by gravity, even though there's, it's pretty flat where they occur. So they tend to spread only locally, which is a good thing because Venus flytrap habitat, you wouldn't want to disperse too far or you'd end up in, a wet area that would be too wet or a dry area that would be too dry. And let me say one other thing about seed predators. I've noticed and others have noticed, I thought people were poaching the seed heads, but actually deer will walk through and just eat the seed heads off of Venus flytraps selectively. It's just amazing to see that deer do that. Can't be that hugely nutritious for them.
Turning it around, rather than insects eating the plants, do the plants tend to trap pests as opposed to beneficial or neutral insects?
No, they eat what will fit in their trap. But let me say something else about things eating Venus flytraps. Nothing eats the actual traps. There's almost no damage to the traps themselves from an insect. And the reason that is that they are incredibly full of tannins. So when we collect the tissue and it sits there, it turns like dark purple because the chlorophyll goes away and the tannins are there for us to see. And they're just black with tannins. So that's one of and it makes it difficult for the extraction of DNA too, and you have a lot of tannins.
All right, well, thank you for that, Johnny. We have a couple more questions, but I'm going to send those to you after the fact, and we can get those distributed to participants, along with some of the other resources that you mentioned today.
Okay.
Yes, we're at the 1 o'clock hour. So Johnny, thank you so much for sharing this information with our audience. And thank you for everyone for joining us. We really appreciated having you with us, your great insights, your great questions. We will share your great ideas about how to deter poaching with Johnny from the chat. Please complete the survey as you're able to give us feedback. We have a variety of virtual, in-person, outdoor classes available. Take a look at our website. David has posted links into the chat for you to access that. And if you're not currently a member, please consider joining the North Carolina Botanical Garden. And there's a membership link in the chat as well. Thank you all. We hope to see you at the next virtual Lunchbox Talk in a couple of weeks. Have a good afternoon.